Okay, you can start.
All right, so contention today is that we should cut military spending, and the first point is that it is an ineffective use of funds. This is money going to the military that could be going to more useful economic pursuits, such as education, such as healthcare, such as almost anything. We're dumping money into tanks and planes that are basically meant to get blown up. We're dumping money into training soldiers, which is extremely expensive. We could put all this money into different things, such as I said, education, things that have proven to stimulate the economy, or even public works projects. The Army is essentially a giant public works project that benefits almost no one, and we're going to talk about it in a second. So my second subpoint says the U.S. basically has no need for the military protection at large scale as it has. We have two massive oceans flanking our entire country. We're basically invulnerable on that front, and thanks to nuclear warfare, any conventional wars don't really make sense anyway. And because of this, because we're spending so much money on something so completely useless, we're actually being put economically behind other first world nations. So you look at something like France, it's all of Scandinavia, all of these nations have the same economic goals that we do, they compete in the same economic markets as we do, but unlike us, they're not wasting trillions every year on a useless military. And as the second point, very quickly, I just want to point out that our military as it is, even if you think it might be a worthwhile pursuit, our history of using it has proven to be extremely ineffective. So in that sense, it's a waste of time, even if the military in general might have been a good idea. Thank you.
So I think Jake has a really interesting idea, but I think that in the end, it's a really bad idea to cut military spending in the United States. So just to deal with some of the things that he talked about, the first thing he talked about was that we can take this money and we can spend it elsewhere. So I mean, that's like true for everything. Like, if I didn't believe that the education system in the United States is good, I could also say like, well, we can take all the money we're investing in like public schools right now and reallocate it towards like social programs and work programs and things like that. I don't think that's a narrowly tailored enough argument to address why military spending in particular is uniquely harmful. But then he says like, well, this doesn't really stimulate the economy. Actually, I mean, that depends on how you spend, right? Obviously, there are always better ways to allocate the money that you spend. Military spending brought us back from the Great Depression. I think that's pretty significant, actually. He talked about like how the U.S. is pretty well defended already. We're behind other countries like France and Scandinavia. So like, I think it's a little difficult to compare the U.S. to France and Scandinavia because first of all, the EU has tons of fiscal austerity problems right now. A lot of countries are thinking of backing out of the euro. I don't think that France is actually in such a great economic state. But the Scandinavian states are simply not comparable to the United States. They have different attitudes towards welfare because everyone's sort of like, I mean, it's a very homogeneous place. People sort of feel an obligation to give back to society. We just don't get that in the United States. That's why we have to like force people to like reallocate their tax dollars towards social welfare. But in the end, I think that the amount of military spending we do does allow us to sort of like have an enormous amount of income. I think that's really useful.
All right, so what I would say to Denise's first point, which is that it's true for anything, I agree it is true for anything, but I think I've given reasons as to why military spending isn't useful. I talked about why our previous use of military spending has not been good. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been an enormous suck of funds, and I think by most objective estimates they've been potentially not successful. And additionally, she points out that military spending stopped the Depression. That's not really true. Spending stopped the Depression. It could have been spending on anything. So, considering that we could spend money on other things that affect all of the citizens, and supposed to affect things that just affect military objectives, I think, the military spending is not a good use of goals. And she points out, well, the EU has fiscal austerity problems. Well, that's true. Imagine how much worse they would be if they had to spend all this money on the military. And Scandinavia is essentially a bunch of socialists, or not comparable. Even if that's the case, I don't think it's true. They get to spend all this extra money they have on these great social programs. Even if that's not true, I think there are plenty of European competitors like England who get to save quite a bit of money. And even if they do have fiscal austerity problems, they would be all the much worse if they had military problems. And now Denise points out that we have more influence in NATO. I think if we had, one SUV and a machine gun, we'd have the most influence in NATO. Considering that there's not a whole lot of competition here because the rest of the first world has figured out they can just mooch off the U.S. So actually, I think if we cut military spending and made the rest of the EU step up, the rest of NATO step up and provide as much as we do, we would have a more balanced NATO effect.
I think it's a really bad idea to reduce our influence in NATO for a number of reasons, but this isn't around about whether the U.S. should stay in NATO or leave NATO. So let's suffice it to say that the amount of military spending we currently do does allow the United States to have an enormous amount of influence, an inordinate amount of influence in NATO. And if we wanted to be more involved in the United Nations, it could allow us to have an enormous amount of leverage in the United Nations. Assuming the UN can do anything. But I think that the amount of military spending, while it seems silly to the average American on the ground, to everyone else in the world, they're terrified of what the U.S. could do. It doesn't matter that conventional warfare isn't what it used to be, because a huge amount of U.S. military spending in the status quo goes towards developing nuclear weapons, maintaining nuclear facilities, developing the types of weapons that are going to be relevant in case there ever is a catastrophic third world war or anything like that. But I think the secondary impacts of having this much military spending is enormously useful to the United States' position in the world. It secures our place as a superpower, and I think in an age where a lot of the BRIC countries, where a lot of transitional economies are going to be reaching the point where they can compete with America in terms of global superpowers, it's really important that we sort of cement our place in the world somehow. And I think one of the ways that we can definitely do that is through military spending, through consistently developing the best technologies in the world. Because as long as we're one step ahead of everyone else, they know that they can't mess with the United States. And I know how incredibly U.S. centric that sounds, but if you're someone if you're in charge of the military